Good evening, everyone. My name is Caitlin Frazier, and I'm currently a first-year liberal studies student at NYU DC. On behalf of the university, and specifically NYU DC Dialogues, I'd like to welcome you here tonight for an important dialogue on socioeconomic disparities in the face of immigration in the United States with this esteemed panel who will join me on this stage. I hope you all had the chance to view the photography exhibit in the upstairs lobby entitled West Side, South Side. The gallery will still be open after the panel, so please come join us, and we would also hope that you would join us for a light reception. I'd like to give special thanks to NEWorks Production, particularly Nolan Williams Jr., who brought this exciting exhibit to NYU DC, as well as the NYU DC Dialogues team for co-sponsoring and supporting this event. Please join me in welcoming the moderator for this evening, Cathleen Farrell, who is the Director of Communications at the National Immigration Forum. Again, thank you for coming, and please silence your cell phones.
Hi, good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. Welcome to spring, or should I say welcome to summer? I think spring was yesterday, and now, it's still spring technically, but anyway. So we have a really fascinating group of folks here tonight. We were having a great conversation in the green room, and luckily we didn't have too much time because I think we could still be in there for about an hour and a half just talking about really fascinating panel that we're going to have tonight. We're going to be talking about culture. We're going to be talking about identity. We're going to be talking about disparities, and we're going to get to what kind of country we want to live in. But I'm going to start by asking everyone to introduce themselves, and then we'll just kick off the conversation. I think we're going to talk for about 40 minutes, and then open it to questions. So, Esther?
Good evening, everyone. My name is Esther Olavarria. I was born in Cuba and grew up in Miami. Worked for many years in Miami as an immigration attorney at a number of different nonprofit organizations, representing largely asylum seekers, but immigrants in other capacities as well. 10 years later, I came up to Washington and worked for Senator Kennedy. Had the honor of working for him as his immigration counsel for many years on immigration reform legislation and other matters. And then when President Obama was elected, I went into the administration working at the Department of Homeland Security, again on immigration legislation and administrative policy issues. And for a while got detailed to the White House again to work on the immigration reform bills, and then later again for Secretary Johnson. At the end of the Obama administration, sometime thereafter, I did a complete change of careers and went to the Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts. Got a call from a friend and said, would you be interested in coming over? And I said, oh my gosh, of course. And I've been there for the last coming on a year, actually. Working on government affairs issues and assorted all kinds of things like the Cuba Festival that we have coming up now, starting next Tuesday, and invite all of you to come. It's going to be terrific.
Hi, I'm Eleanor. I'm a business immigration attorney. I've been doing business immigration for almost 20 years. I focused for 10 years on global immigration, and now I do exclusively U.S. immigration and mostly compliance work.
Good evening. Really delighted to be here and to be part of this panel. My name is Rachel Peric. I'm the executive director of an organization called Welcoming America, and I'm sure you'll be hearing more about that. On a personal note, I am the daughter and granddaughter of refugees. My mother and grandparents came to this country in 1949. My grandparents had been Holocaust survivors who had lost everyone that they loved in the world because of where hatred and bigotry can take us. And I grew up watching this movie, West Side Story, as the daughter also of New Yorkers, and thinking about how universal a theme that is, not only here in the US, but across the world, and look forward to talking more about that tonight.
Good evening, everyone. Y'all can talk back, come on. This is informal. Hey, good evening, everyone. So thank you all so much for being here, and let me thank NYU Washington, the team here, Tom and Kevin and Polly and Michael and everyone. Thank you so much for making this possible and for partnering with us on this. So that's my official kind of word of thanks and my NEWorks hat. And let me introduce myself, Nolan Williams Jr. I am CEO of NEWorks Productions. We are based in Washington, DC and Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And as of this year, we're also establishing a footprint in Atlanta, Georgia. The exhibition, how many of you had a chance to see the exhibition upstairs? Most of you? Okay, great. Love to get your feedback on it. The exhibition is a reflection of that wider footprint that we now have. Really thrilled about this project, and I'll talk about that more in a minute. But NEWorks Productions is purposed to leverage the power of music and the arts for community engagement and social good. And all of our projects deal with inspirational arts programming, and all of our projects inspire and uplift, they educate, and they commemorate. And for us, those are 4 pillars that have very distinct meanings. We're grateful that we partner with wonderful organizations like NYU Dialogues and the Kennedy Center and the Mann Center for the Performing Arts and Fulton County Arts and Culture to do a range of programming. And so I can't wait to get started on this conversation.
Great.
Thank you all so much for being here.
Very good. So Nolan, I'm actually going to go right back to you now and ask you why we're here tonight. If you can tell us a bit about the exhibition, the origin of it, and what we're trying to do with this exhibition.
Sure. So this project really is a part of a larger festival that I'm curating, that NEWorks is curating, along with the Mann Center for the Performing Arts. For those of you who don't know the Mann Center, it's based in Philadelphia. You know Wolf Trap here. Wolf Trap is, the Mann is like Philadelphia's Wolf Trap, but Wolf Trap on steroids, because the Mann Center has a capacity for nearly 14,000. So it is a very large-sized venue. It is the premier outdoor summer venue for the city of Philadelphia. It sits in the middle of Fairmount Park, and it is a beautiful campus. We have been working with the Mann Center for 5 years to do these curatorial festivals, and these festivals have dealt with a range of subject matter, but usually at some point we find a way to connect with social justice in some kind of meaningful way. And this year, in looking at Bernstein and the year of his centenary, the 100th year of his birthday, we wanted to do something, like most arts organizations around Bernstein, but we wanted to go beyond just what people know. And so we've created and curated this festival called Brilliantly Bernstein Beyond the Baton. How's that for alliteration, right? Lots of B's. And, but it's about understanding that Leonard Bernstein understood his role, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, as an artist citizen, which is a buzzword that we're hearing more about in our times. But before that word was ever coined, Leonard Bernstein was actually exemplifying that. In 1944, when he put On the Town on Broadway with his cohorts, he put a Japanese American in a lead role, in that role on Broadway, in that show on Broadway. And Japan had just bombed Pearl Harbor, right? And then not only that, he put soldiers on stage as dancers. Half of them were white, half of them were black. They both wore the same uniforms. So you had an integrated soldier cast of dancers, and the US military was not yet integrated. So you want to talk about leveraging a platform to make a statement and to push our country towards becoming a more perfect union. Bernstein did that in so many different ways. And so this festival really is about drawing inspiration from Bernstein in that way. And we felt that West Side Story is such an iconic work. Why not take that to tell a story of what's going on in our country right now? We embedded this project in 5 schools in Philly, in Atlanta, and DC, American University, University of the District of Columbia here, Art Institute of Atlanta and Clark Atlanta University in Atlanta, and the University of the Arts in Philadelphia. And these students have been dealing with this matter of West Side, South Side, looking at the face of immigration, looking at the face of socioeconomic disparities in our communities throughout this term. And they've been challenged to go into their communities, to meet people, to go into neighborhoods that they wouldn't normally go into, and to really kind of find the hard truth, the hard reality of what's happening in our communities and here in America. And I think many of you will hopefully agree from what you've seen that they've done an amazing job of capturing that. And so this exhibition is opening here. I don't know, is Timothy here? I don't see Timothy. Hey, Timothy, why don't you stand up? Timothy McPhillips, a student at American University. This is Timothy's work right here called The River Divides. It's one of my favorite pieces. It's inspired by Langston Hughes' poem, I Too Sing America. I am the darker brother they send me to eat in the kitchen when company comes, but I laugh and eat and grow strong. Tomorrow I'll be at the table when company comes. No one would dare say to me, eat in the kitchen. Besides, they'll see how beautiful I am and feel ashamed. I too am America. So Timothy took his dining room chair down to the Anacostia River, set his chair in the middle of the river, and caught this image. The river divides. Are there any other students here, student artists from any of our schools, if you will stand? Any other students here from American or UDC? Okay. Well, Timothy, you're representing today. But this is why we've done this project, right? To get young people, young creatives thinking about these subject matters and finding their voice and finding their perspective on this. I'll stop here, and I'm sure we'll be able to talk more about this, but this might be a great opportunity, Esther, for you to connect the dots, when we talk about citizen artistry.
Citizen artist, sure. So citizen artist is a, I would say, a fairly new concept, and it's one that the Kennedy Center has embraced. We have started programs. Well, we have a number of very, very well-known artists who are our premier citizen artists. The first one that comes to mind is Yo-Yo Ma. And what he has done to just give back to the community has been incredible. Going with us to communities all around the country. Well, let me preface it by saying, as part of the citizen artist concept, we recently launched a new program called Arts Across America. And we work in conjunction with our citizen artists like Yo-Yo Ma, and with citizen artists much younger, less well-established individuals in communities all over the country who are using their art form to positively impact their community. So people like Yo-Yo Ma work with, for example, a young man named VJ, whose last name I cannot remember now, in Los Angeles, who is a classically trained musician, I think performs with the LA Symphony Orchestra, who has created this street symphony and goes and performs on the streets of LA with homeless individuals and brings them in to be part of the symphony and they help him create music together. Yo-Yo Ma went with us to, for example, Corona, California, more recently for Lauderdale. One of the things that we've been doing is leveraging the abilities of these citizen artists to spotlight work that is happening in communities around the country that aren't necessarily seen as art hubs. So we're not going to go to New York, we're not going to go to Chicago, we're going to go to Corona, California. I don't know how many of you had heard of Corona, California, but small towns. We're going to Braddock, Pennsylvania in June, and we were in probably one of the poorest neighborhoods in Fort Lauderdale a couple of weekends. Again, highlighting the work that's going on by artists in those communities and by very, very young people. One of the things that I was most struck by was we visited a magnet elementary school where we had really young, adorable kids who are just incredible performers, singers, dancers, musicians. We then went to the high school, again, incredible performers. So highlighting the work that they were doing, bringing in elected officials, business leaders, the Chamber of Commerce, the Urban League, all to work together to empower citizen artists and emerging artists in communities around the country, and not just to allow them to succeed in their art form, but to use their art form for social good. For example, leveraging the power of healing through music. In Fort Lauderdale, we brought students from the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas school to the concert to participate in this concert for healing with Yo-Yo Ma, and another musician from the Silk Ensemble with him. So really powerful, just inspiring work all around the country, and it's something that we want to continue to do. We just launched it, but our goal is to try to go to all 50 states, identify communities in all of 50 states, to lift up what's going on in those localities, and we see it as a part of John F. Kennedy's legacy, too. I don't know if many of you know that the Kennedy Center, besides being a performing arts venue, is the living memorial to President Kennedy. So one of the things that we constantly try to do is create programming around the ideals that are mostly aligned with with President Kennedy: courage, justice, service, gratitude, and freedom. And so focusing on programming to elevate those ideals. I think I'll stop there.
Yeah, and I think to make the connection then, what we're seeing the Kennedy Center do, and Yo-Yo Ma and all of these artists, it's amazing to think that folk like Duke Ellington and folk like Louis Armstrong and folk like Lenny Bernstein were doing this before we had a fancy term for it, right? They were recognizing that their artistry also came with a level of responsibility to really make a difference and have an impact upon community. And that's also the spirit by which we have commissioned these young artists to create this work. So let's talk a bit more about that.
Maybe talk a little bit about West Side Story. Who has not seen West Side Story? Okay, good. Oh, you have to see it then. So we were talking a little bit about how daring Bernstein was, and you mentioned the example you just mentioned, but backstage we were talking about this whole idea of taking one of the most beloved Shakespearean plays, Romeo and Juliet, and transferring it to an urban scene, but not only an urban setting, it was a setting of, with some tension between there was a racial divide, if you remember the story, between Puerto Rican gangs and a white gang. They were all Americans, though, but the Puerto Ricans were the other. And when we talk about socioeconomic disparity, we're talking about the other, be that people of color, people who have fewer advantages, people who are poorer, and the immigrant. And I think that might be a good segue into Alan and talking a little bit about your work and your work in immigration and your interest.
Right. So specifically, I'm going to speak about African Americans and Africans and sort of that social economic disparity, but understanding under the concept that money doesn't also equal socioeconomic disparity. Sometimes it's just about access to health care, access to rights, freedom in a general sense. You will notice in the United States, when you sort of think about the African immigrant, there are two types: those that come from Europe and Africa, the continent, and those that come from the Caribbean. And most of those that come from the Caribbean populate the northeast of America. So it's very rare to find someone who's Caribbean throughout the rest of the United States. Those are generally populated by Africans from Africa. But also in understanding that is that they sort of follow the American dream, where the first immigrant that comes over may be the day laborer, but the second generation always elevates to a next level. And that's across the board. And what you will find is that they are exemplary in education, almost in higher education, compared to the African American in most stratospheres. They also are the owners of most African American businesses that we consider are founded by immigrants, or the first generation from that immigrant. So it's really important. So when you sort of think about that divide and what they add to America in general, is that you sort of see where that sort of infuses black business and black money, because much like in Washington, D.C. and the community on 9th Street and U Street, they give back to the community. The dollar spent over and over again in their community before it leaves their community. And I think that's really something important to sort of understand. And sort of in America, when you start thinking about the other, it is hard sometimes for African American communities. I went to Morehouse, which is a unique experience because it's all male, and it's mostly African American. There are others that are there too. But the experience of my first meeting of an African in a school setting didn't bring up other. It sort of brought up how are we alike and similar, and specifically when you start talking about shared history. And I think that that's sort of the goal among most communities, to sort of have this melting pot. And among that, I think that's super important to also to understand that that's just not it. There are also Africans who are Mexican who are also immigrating to this country that don't take us out of the Latino culture at all, to understand that divide between Cuba and the Dominican Republic. And so sort of understanding that sort of mix and sort of cultural divide that sort of works together. And I think the biggest way those things sort of fix themselves is the West Side Story, is when you love the other and you make the anomaly that becomes the popular sort of theme of what happens.
And Rachel, you do some really interesting work with the other, with the stranger, with immigrants. Can you tell us a bit about your organization?
Yeah, of course. So my organization is called Welcoming America, and we work in communities all over the U.S. We have a membership network that works in places that are home to about 1 in 8 Americans. And our work is really about bridging the borders that exist in communities. And I love this conversation because I think, it's so clear that art is such an important tool for bridging those divides. And, we often think about immigration as being an issue about borders, borders around our country, but really it's about the borders in our communities and who belongs when a community changes. And so our work is really about helping communities do 2 things. One, try to really bridge those divides and create a culture in which everyone, including immigrants, but really truly everyone, can feel like they belong. And if you think about that experience, and certainly it's a big part of the story of West Side Story, what does it mean to belong in America? And obviously that's something that we're deeply reckoning with right now. For me, being an American is about the ideal that everyone can belong, the ideal that it doesn't matter where you come from, your race, who you pray to, we are all American. But not every place lives up to that ideal, and so there's important work to be done in communities. So it's about a culture of belonging, and then it's also about creating the policies and the practices in a community to make sure that everyone can truly participate at their fullest. So reducing the barriers that people face to full opportunity in a community systematically. There's a lot of ways that happens, but we think that the best way for that to happen is for leaders in a community to define what it means for their own community to be an inclusive and equitable place, and to work whether it's in the education sector, whether it's in the workforce, whether it's within the halls of city government, to make sure that everyone has a place and a voice in that community.
That's great.
So,
Thank you.
Kathleen, I want to put you on the spot
Oh,
because
no.
because we were talking about this. Can you share a bit about the conversations that you're having? Because I think that's
Absolutely.
a great segue.
Yeah, absolutely. So I work for a very interesting organization. I've worked there for the last 4 years. I was a journalist for many, many years, but I started working for the National Immigration Forum in June of 2014. I am an immigrant myself. I am actually a newly minted citizen. I became a citizen of this great country of ours. Thank you. That's how I feel. Thank you. I became an American citizen on March 13th of this year. I have embraced this country because this country has an amazing idea. This country is very troubled right now. But I have enormous faith in this country. And I'm going to get back to this because, Alan, you mentioned immigrants and their successes generation after generation. And I think that Americans come in and we kind of inject new blood into what is a great country and a great idea. But back to your question. So the National Immigration Forum is holding a series of conversations around the country right now in rural and suburban communities. And we're talking to folks about their anxieties. And we really want to hear what people are concerned about and what they're afraid of. And it is really fascinating. You know, we're not too far along. We're about 8 conversations in, and we hope to do several dozen. But what we're hearing so far is, you know, how are people identifying as American and the different ways that they identify as American. It's absolutely fascinating. I think I would be getting ahead of myself if I gave you too much information at this point about it. But people identify first as themselves, and then they, identify as part of a family and a bigger part of their community. All over the country, though, the country is so diverse. Even in the most rural areas, we're seeing more and more immigration, and people having the connection and knowing immigrants, and that's changing their lives. Probably it's a little bit of a shock at times, but more and more we see that people identify. My boss is fond of saying that, they're afraid of the Juan or Muhammad that they don't know, but they're comfortable with the one that they do know. And it's very true. The minute that we start talking about other human beings who we know, who we go to church with, who coach our kids' soccer team, that's just Jose, or that is just Aziz, or, we know these people. We don't care about their immigration status until it becomes an issue. Another thing I think that that's really important to keep in mind is that immigration as a concept might be kind of remote to people, but everybody knows an immigrant. And immigrants as people are very relevant, and they really change our lives.
And I just want to add to that. I think it's really interesting to think about the time in which West Side Story was made. Was actually in the last century just about one of the lowest points in terms of the percentage of immigrants in our country, and starting around 1965, that percentage basically doubled.
Because of immigration law.
Because of immigration, yes.
Because of changes in immigration law.
Correct. Immigration law does have an impact, let's be clear. But what was interesting in that doubling is that people didn't go to, people continued to go to New York and Chicago and some of the big immigrant gateways that we think of, but they also went to a lot of small towns, we're talking about Arkansas, Georgia, places that didn't have a recent history of immigration. And so the experience of change in those communities was startling. And we often think about what it means to adapt as a new person in a community, but we don't always think about what it means to adapt as a person who's lived in that community your whole life. And we use this metaphor that, if you think about a new person being planted into a community like a seed into soil, it's really difficult for that person to be successful if you're, planted into a desert. And typically what we do, as advocates for immigrants or as a community in general, is we put all the onus on the new person. You need to adapt. We're going to water that seed with services which are important. But if we don't pay attention to the soil around that seed, which is the broader community and their feelings and their fears and their concerns, and really try to create that bridge, then you create really the dry kindling for what we see now, which is political opportunists who just throw a match right in, pit people against one another, which again is really the story of West Side Story. And exploit that, and it's harmful to communities and it's harmful to democracy, and there's a different way.
But I think it's interesting in the drop of the West Side Story, of them both being gangs, having the same sort of composition and sort of doing the same sort of thing, but seeing it as the other when you're basically the same. And what I really respect about this project is the mix of the schools, which whether purposeful or not purposeful, the University of DC is a great divide in DC. It is the only public university among the stars that we see from outside the DC unit that's accessible to the DC community and for local people. And people may not know, but Clark Atlanta University is an HBCU and the Art Institute. So it has people that are sort of thinking from different perspectives and mixing. And I think one of the challenges that you have when you are at when you're in NYU or you're at American is to sort of explore the other. And I think that that's part of it. Also, the onus is on you to sort of meet and greet and become and understand how you're alike rather than how you're different. And I think that's one of the challenges that face every community, is to sort of think about, oh my God, you have this great difference than mine, rather than saying you have this great understanding. And that's sort of what we sort of try to do in immigration. And I think if you sort of look at immigration as a whole, when you think of an immigrant, you probably think of the undocumented. But for my business, everybody's documented. And there's the Indian and the Chinese national that did everything the right way, that are here waiting for 10 to 20 years to be able to avail themselves of citizenship, which is problematic. And then you see immigration pit them against the individual who's also been here for 10 to 20 years, working, done nothing wrong, who also should have access to immigration. So it shouldn't always be the concept or one or the other. It should be the concept of, okay, there's both equitable arguments, and we'll sort of work in the middle of that space to sort of get an agreement there.
Yeah, I mean, the big question that I think we're all grappling with is not just what kind of country we are. I think it's what do we want to be, and I think there are certain things that are already in motion. I was mentioning that when I did my citizenship interview in February, I looked around the room, and believe me, I was the only white middle-aged woman there. Everybody else was a person of color, and I thought, yes, that's the country we are. This is not the country we're becoming, it's the country we already are. So, and you know, Rachel, you were talking about integration and how do we make sure that we help the new immigrant, but also how do we make sure that we help the community? And we talk a lot about that in my work as well, about how do we make sure that not only the new immigrant is able to develop him or herself fully in this country, but how do Americans take advantage of the incredible experience that people bring from other countries, whether or not they are low or medium or high skilled, they are bringing language, culture, new food. I mean, look at DC. Tell me if you are looking for some kind of food from anywhere on the planet, if you can or cannot find it. And I think we all embrace that. So I wanted to get back to this point that you mentioned before about immigrants bettering themselves in subsequent generations. Could you also talk a little bit about how different immigrant groups kind of fire each other on and the innovation there and the energy? I think maybe that's the word I'm looking for.
Well, I don't know how to better explain it than generally one of the concepts that I think that we understand, Esther probably understands better than we do. Our universities educate most of the world. We have a large population of foreign students that come here to do innovative work, to do basically workshop and lab work, create things, your iPhone, whatever new spectacular thing you have is generally from the mind of a foreign national. Most of the national awards that we've won in science and the arts has been from someone who is either an immigrant or the first generation of an immigrant family. So understanding that, then you also have the challenge that after they graduate, how can they stay, which is a limiting thing of sort of sending people around the world. And that's a certain class of individuals, but it does not exclude people from the continent. I mean, I think the diversity visa is a true sign of how you can reach across the world and bring people here who traditionally would not come because of location and opportunity to the United States. And so what they do is, once you come in and you really educate yourself and better yourself, and we teach them that, they go back and they think of ways to re-engineer their communities, right? Because generally the focus that I find from immigrant families is generally one of community, which is a little bit different, not to say it's different than American, but it's a higher exponential sort of expression of this education. This degree is not about me. This degree is about my mom and my family and my extended family. This is our opportunity.
Made.
Yeah, and this is their opportunity, whereas some people sort of have that individual perspective, so they take it back to the community with the intent of bettering everything. And you will find that across the board. And even sometimes in the innovation, it's not about the money, it's about the end result, which could be better food, better use of plastic, better farming, and better technology, smarter technology, I think is really creative. And now you'll see, and I don't know if you've sort of seen this at all, but in the peace world and sort of understanding how to get communities to come together, there's a big focus on women in immigration, because when you think of terrorism on any level, you generally don't think of a woman, right? And when you sort of think about peace in communities and sort of what holds people together, whether it be African, Indian, national, whatever family you sort of think of, when you think of the unit, you generally think of the mom. And so there's a big sort of world focus right now on what women, immigrants, can bring to the conversation as Americans and sort of building that divide. Because what you can't understand is mom, right? If you're in the mom and you're in the PTA and you all have kids, you have a greater understanding of building a relationship of saying what it is to be a mom, what it is to get someone to soccer practice, what it is to get someone's grades, what it is to get someone paid. And I don't mean that in a gender-specific way, because I understand that men can be pretty good moms too, are homemakers, but just sort of understanding what things different people bring to the conversation. And I think that one of those things that you find specifically now you look at the caravans is the concept of survival, right? These women, mostly from El Salvador or Honduras, have taken their kids miles across different countries by foot to the border to a place where the president said, you will not get in, don't come. And they've come anyway. That level of sacrifice and commitment to family and community is something exemplary.
And it's interesting you bring up the caravan because, the president's saying you will not get in because they are a security threat. Moms and babies are a security threat. So this is the country that we are right now, temporarily, but I think we're going to be something else.
I think with respect to, let's talk about the caravan and
Yep.
the moms and,
Yep.
and the children. They're, as you mentioned, they're coming from El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. Those countries have among the highest murder rates in the entire world right now, and much of the violence is aimed at women and at young children. Gangs are prevalent there, so these people are fleeing for their lives. They're not coming, mostly for economic opportunities or any of the things that
They're certainly not coming to hurt us.
They're not, and they're certainly not coming to hurt us. In fact, what they're doing is once they come to the border, they turn themselves in. They're not trying to sneak in. They're actually turning themselves in to seek asylum, seek protection in this country. It's a really, really tragic situation, and one that we should identify not as a security problem, but as a humanitarian problem, and find a humanitarian solution for. One, by providing them, as we are required to do under our laws, the opportunity to seek protection, but two, look at the root causes of migration in those countries and address those. Address the violence that's going on there, provide more economic opportunities so teenagers don't turn to gangs as the only solution and have other solutions. I mean, in some ways it mirrors what's happening in many of our cities around the country. I wanted to add something with respect to, we've talked about immigrants being able to assimilate and succeed generation after generation. And one of the most important factors, in my view, is the ability to have legal status in this country. And you'll see many, many immigrants coming for many, many years, and they are stuck in low-wage jobs. They're not able to enroll in English classes. They're not able to attend universities because they have no legal status. They're not even able to get work permits, much less driver's licenses. So they live in a shadow economy. But with the ability to obtain legal status, their lives radically change. And we saw the most, I think, best illustrated in the last 4, 5, 6 years under the DACA program that provided work permits, just work permits, not even permanent legal status, to young people that enabled them then to be able to go to school, to get driver's licenses, to be able to live without that fear that they had been living with for so many years. I think that there's a lot, and you probably see it all the time, but there's a belief that people just don't try to get legal, that there are ways to do it and they just don't do it.
Why don't they get in the line?
Yeah, why don't they get in the line?
There's no line.
Why don't they apply for green cards like my grandmother did years ago? And the problem is that our immigration system is truly, truly broken. So you have no legal avenues for people to seek relief. The super well-educated individuals that you were talking about, graduating with masters and PhDs in all the STEM fields, right now many of them don't have any opportunity to obtain, to stay here permanently again, because the laws that we have in place now haven't been changed since 1990. This is how long. And so imagine our economy today compared to our economy in 1990. Imagine the desire to unite with your family back in 1990 compared to the numbers that we have now trying to unite with their families.
Probably, an example I always use, and the lawyers on the panel can correct me here, but the last really big immigration reform that we had, really huge, was 1965. We've had other significant ones, but really big. Would you drive a 1965 car? This is, I think about this a lot, that we do not have a 21st century immigration system. That is hurting us. That is hurting our country. And I think we can turn it back on Americans and say, well, hang on, don't you want these people? We already have a workforce gap at all levels, and we're hurting ourselves.
Yeah, I wanted to mention, if you watched or saw the exhibition there are pieces that capture exactly what you were saying. The third image in the exhibition is of a guy named Mario. And Mario, if you read his statement, he talks about living in Atlanta but not being able to get a work permit, that they have to drive perhaps as far as from Atlanta to Maryland to try to get work permits. And so...
Identification, not work permits, but...
Identification, yeah. What's powerful about what the students were able to do then with these images is to capture these stories. The second image in the exhibition is of a lady who, at the time her picture was taken, had just come into the country 3 months prior, right? And then the very first image is called In the Shadows because it's a reminder of so many folk who literally are living in the fear and living in the shadows. So just making those connections.
So how difficult was it for the students? These are young people. They're not seasoned journalists or photographers. How difficult was it for them to get people to tell them their stories?
Yeah, I think it was a challenge. I think the teachers, and I really have to recognize Ewan Baggis and Barbara Proud and Darnell Wilburn and Deirdre Tyree Smith and E. Taylor Barefoot for their exceptional leadership. They bought into this project and they guided the students through this process. And then I went to all of the schools to meet with the students at different points along the way. What was interesting in the beginning, I think there was eagerness about the project, right? So there's always the excitement, yeah. And then it's the reality of balancing work and school life with when do I have time to actually go into these neighborhoods? And then is the recognition that the time I have is generally at night, which means I'm going into parts of the town that I don't normally go to, and it's dark, right? And so we heard stories about people feeling threatened and afraid to go into certain neighborhoods. What a number of the students did initially was to take pictures of buildings, and this was a very interesting thing. We were talking about this beforehand. And they thought that by taking a picture of the Korean deli or a picture of the Chinese market, that would suffice in being able to show this idea of diversity. And we kept challenging them, no, that's really great. Wonderful picture of the building. Exceptional picture, great lighting, wonderful color, just magnifique. Now go back and try to meet the shop owners, right? Try to meet the folk who go there, right? And figure out what their stories are. And some of them found that they went back and people weren't willing to talk to them. And we can probably surmise what that means. Those are probably folk who are undocumented and like, get the camera out of my face, and I don't want to talk to you. But many of them found success in getting people to share their stories. And we see those testimonials throughout the exhibition. And I think for those who were brave enough to keep going and keep trying, the payoff was great because to your point, Alan, we were very intentional about choosing the diversity of schools, right? And it was important that these schools, as diverse as they are, be in dialogue, even not knowing each other, but that they be in dialogue about this subject matter. It was important for those who come from a place of privilege to be made uncomfortable. It was important for those who are African American, who maybe only think about our perspective and our pain, which is its own kind of story that mirrors the other and a lot of what we're talking about for immigrants, but to recognize that we're not the only ones going through these kinds of experiences, right? And to make those vital connections.
So, you mentioned that it was difficult for these young artists initially. It's difficult for the artist, but it changes the artist once he or she has the experience of creating the artwork. How does the artwork affect the rest of us and change us as people who are appreciating the artwork? What does seeing this artwork do? Does it help bridge the divide? Does it close the gap?
Well, I believe that it does. And I was just thinking as you were talking, I think one of the most powerful books I have read on the experience of migration. Has anyone here read Isabel Wilkerson's The Warmth of Other Suns? Yeah. And I think, I mean, as a work of art that translates the experience of personal story of African Americans making their way from the Jim Crow South to the North, where they were not very welcomed. You know, I think that these are human experiences, and the best lens through which to build empathy and understand what that experience feels like is to literally walk in somebody else's shoes. And I don't know any more powerful way to do that than through story and through art. And then, you know, I think just to connect some of those experiences, the beauty for me of West Side Story and sort of the agony of West Side Story too is that ultimately it's a story about the self-defeating nature of hating the other. You know, you wound the other person, but in the end, you yourself are wounded, and that's the cycle that never ends. Is the tragedy of West Side Story, and so I think the moment we're in is asking ourselves, how do we reverse that cycle? How do we take the vicious cycle and make it a virtuous cycle? And there's a big win. And if you didn't care about this for moral reasons, there was just a report that came out from the Kellogg Foundation about the huge economic gains this country would see in the next 50 years if we closed gaps around racial equity. Huge gains, like $8 trillion to our economy. And so, you know, I think we need to be asking ourselves now, you know, how do we hear each other's stories at this time of growing divides? How do we do more listening? You were talking about that. And how do we really lean into some of these uncomfortable realities about our past and about the gap between what we believe aspirationally is the American dream and what the lived American dream is for many, many Americans?
I'm thinking that, you know, you mentioned the economic contributions, right, and in closing the racial disparities gap. And the same is true of immigrants. We know this about, you know, the loss to the country if we start deporting DACA recipients. It's really hard nowadays, though, to have a fact-based conversation with people. And I'm wondering if, as it really is, people just don't want to hear, or they don't believe the source. I think it's the guy who yells the loudest and who's the biggest bully whose facts are accepted as truth. So I think, you know, that's probably the power of storytelling right now, and going back to how do we know people? How do we meet them? You know, I don't know. I mean, Alan, what's your experience? You deal with so many immigrants and in your work.
So yeah, I think
and Fox News, yes.
the power of truth is not the same that it's always been. It's the power of perspective and objective. And I think that it's important to always put yourself in the other person's shoe and consider that for them, that is their truth, and sort of listen to where their perspective is. And that's where people sort of get off the road. And I think that's sort of what happens a lot in the divide, is that people come into communities and tell them what's best for them. Right? And I think it happens in this divide that you'll see that a lot of people are having conversations about undocumented people getting to be citizens, where undocumented people really just want to be left alone. Give me a work authorization and I don't really care, right? Leave me alone. And so when communities are able to find for themselves what they need, and then if you're open to the conversation of saying, which I think your dialogues are important to say, because I've found in middle America, people do consider it a threat for whatever it is, right? It can either be a threat because you're browning America. It can either be a threat because my son can't find a job, right? It can either be a threat because you got a better education than I have. It could be a threat because I perceive that you have a better life than I have. And all of those things are truth and realities to generations that have been here for years that may still have the same cow farm, you know, and have the same sort of assets and educational level. And to me, I have to say to them, I hear your truth, but this isn't the problem, right? It isn't the other that's your problem. You have a different issue. Let's see what that issue is. But it's not about the scapegoating. And I think that's really what's important about the artwork. I mean, I think when we talk about the art in itself, I also find that in the United States, language is a barrier, because it is only in Puerto Rico where you can have dual American documents, both Spanish and English. And if we want to be real, you know, most of Texas, New Mexico were Mexico territories, and a lot of people there only speak Spanish. And even in New York and somewhere east of Miami, it is a second language. And to not give people access because of language barriers doesn't hurt them. It hurts us because it just isolates that community even more. So I think it goes back down to the fundamental thing, which we'll probably talk about in a minute. Is it assimilation? Is it a melting pot? Is it a stew? I mean, you sort of have to find that balance, and then once you find what that balance is, then you can work away from it. But in my studies, I will tell you that the concept of a white America will not be just by birth populations in a couple of years. So you can either slow it down, but you won't stop it. So if that's your fear, sort of keeping the immigrant out isn't the best way to do it.
That ship has sailed. Yeah. Yeah.
But also let's think about how that message lands with people in the middle part of America, right? So, I think the greatest sense of threat comes from the fear that we don't share the same values. That you on that other side of town don't care about the same things I care about. When in fact, we're all trying to raise a family, and we're all struggling to put bread on the table. And so that's the place that where we need to find those connections. And again, I come back to art as another really powerful way to do that and to show that.
A lot of it is going back to what we said, it's the fear of the unknown. So when someone, through storytelling, through other means, and gets to know an individual who is not like that person, then the barriers, oftentimes the barriers break down. I mean, we would use, when I was on the Hill, we would use storytelling very effectively by finding constituents in members' districts, in member states, and bring them in so these people could tell their own stories to the member of Congress or to their staff to help break down, the fears, and win over support for, the measures that we were seeking to get enacted.
Well, one of the things that we've found very powerful in our work is not just have people, immigrants tell their stories, but people who know those immigrants tell their stories. So what we call validators. We occupy a very interesting or a unique space, I think, in the immigration advocacy world, because we work with the center-right, and we work, with moderate to very conservative folks, and they are all people who want a good America too. And that is, Rachel, to your point about shared values, is let's identify those values. So what we've found is it's great to get the young DACA recipients out there telling their stories. Better still, more powerful still, is having the pastor of their local church and the DACA recipient, their employer and the DACA recipient tell those stories, because these are all what we would say your typical American from the heartland. They look and sound like what we imagine as your typical American, pitted with, or accompanying these young people. And it's really powerful to hear those stories. And exactly what I was talking about before, it's the Jose and the Mohammed who they're not strangers.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the other things that we probably should talk about, just because it's real, is this considered of the perfect immigrant that's never had a crime or never been interacting with the law, this sort of concept of you need to be the purest of purists when every American is not the purest of pure. This sort of concept of disparity that it creates in DACA, where kids who were hanging out in high school with some American kid that got involved or had a little bit of marijuana or some marijuana paraphernalia. For the American kid, it's a slap on the hand of detention. For the foreign nationalist, deportation. Those sort of things aren't real. Those are false equivalences. This concept that immigrants come here and do more crime, there are now 1,000 reports. Literally today on NPR, there are literally 5 reports that prove that to be otherwise not true. And the concept that entering the United States is a crime, it is a misdemeanor, not a felony, not some big sort of thing. And you probably don't know what that means for a lawyer, but that's a small time thing.
What's the equivalent of running through the speeding on a DC street? Yeah.
So I just sort of think that you should sort of think about those things, and the concept of think of yourself as a foreign national that has been here for 25 years, and now you're going to become a citizen. And all of a sudden, back when you were in high school, there was this arrest in this small county that comes up, and now all of a sudden you're up for deportation. That is an odd world to be in, where you sort of have this dichotomy of people who are supposedly perfect and people who are unperfect. And I think that the same sort of works for the American, where you have, we lock up most of our population, and then when people sort of have done the time, we don't put them back in our community. They are now other. You're excluded, maybe even from these institutions. And I think that that's what some of the pictures also sort of speak to when they say a safe neighborhood. What does that mean, a safe neighborhood? Is my neighborhood safe? I mean, what is that sort of concept of a fear out of the perception of what's going to happen to you in a neighborhood? That's something that's learned, right? Not something that's actually, I think, is there, because I think harm is everywhere. And on the very same end, I want you to think about this as an American. Those small crimes, whatever they may be, they robbed a store to feed their kids, or they, took food stamps, public assistance, and they didn't have a right to it because their kids were starving, or something like that, is no different than the Wall Street crimes or the insurance crimes that sort of happen that people don't go to jail for that hurt a greater population. So you need to sort of have perspective when you sort of evaluate those differences.
I think something else that we want to think about as citizens in a community is, do we really want to put our law enforcement resources going after these people who have done a very minor harm compared to, we don't have unlimited resources to take care of a community. Don't we want to live in safe communities, focus on people who are really going to hurt us?
Yeah, there's an interesting piece, and I encourage everyone to see it. It's in the south side of the exhibition. It's called 1,584 Feet of Separation. And it's done by Chloe Hollingsworth, who's a student at University of the Arts. It's a diptych, and at the top of it, it has a picture of the brand spanking new 76ers training facility that was just built on the Camden waterfront. And then under it, it has a picture of the Camden County Jail that's also near the waterfront. And those two facilities are separated by 1,584 feet. Very powerful image. There are a couple of things that stand out about it, and there's a board next to, or a narrative next to it, that reminds us that the 76ers training facility was built with $82 million in tax credits. And we see that around the country, right, with new sports arenas and training facilities as a way of luring sports camps into our communities. We will literally give them hundreds of millions of dollars in tax credits, right? But we will not spend even a fraction of that to fix the preschool to prison pipeline, right? So we talk about disparity, and when you read that narrative, it also just reminds us that when you look at the government's allocation for increases in educational spending versus the allocation towards prisons, there's just no comparison. Like the funding for prisons has increased threefold over funding for education in the same period of time. So what does that say about us as a society, right? And then, you look at someone also in the exhibition like David, the artist, who got into trouble, spent most of his life incarcerated, and you see the two images next to one another and see what an amazing artist he is. And you just wonder, wow, if we had some different systems in place, how could we avert more Davids from getting into that pipeline, right? Where are our priorities?
Yeah, and you pointed out that piece to me when we were upstairs, and because I loved the image of his hand, and you gave me the background, and I keep thinking, what's the talent that we've lost because we're not investing in people in the right way? And
then even to your point, Alan, once they return to society, they don't really return to society, right? They're forever... it's like the scarlet letter. You forever wear the brand, and you have no voting privileges, and it's hard to find work. It's just questions that we really need to raise, right? And I'm grateful that these young creators are bold enough to raise these questions for us through their images.
So I don't wear a watch. I don't have a time check, but I think we can open it up to questions. Is that right? Yeah. So.
Regina?
Quick question. Thank you. I'm curious. you just achieved your citizenship, American citizenship. Congratulations.
Thank you.
How long did it take you to achieve that goal?
So I actually came here in late 2000, and I was on an H-1B visa, which is, I think you were alluding to that when you talked about 1990. It's a professional visa. They're only about, I think, again, the lawyers can correct me, about 85,000 a year given out, and that's spread across, tech companies and other high-skilled industry. We need a lot more than 85,000 people to fill those jobs. So I was extremely fortunate. I actually came the year of a historic high. I think there were 195,000. We still need many more people. I was on that visa for about 7 years before I got my green card. Had my green card for 5 years. It took me a while for a whole lot of reasons. It took me another 5 years almost 5 years before I applied. My oldest daughter had turned 18 in that period, and she applied first. She led the way in the family, and she became a citizen 4 years ago, and she is now at the U.S. Naval Academy, Annapolis. She's serving her country, and she's a great example to us. I was telling the panelists beforehand that my younger daughter, so I applied in February of the previous year. It took more than a year to actually become a citizen for the whole process. My youngest daughter had turned 18 only 2 months before I became a citizen. Had the process been what it promises to be, which is anywhere between 4 and 8 months, and as opposed to 12, 13, or longer, my daughter would have become a citizen at the same time I did. So we had to do a separate application for her, and hers is pending. It'll probably take another year. But she said something to me that was really poignant a couple of days after I was naturalized. And she said, "Mommy, I feel like you and Manuela have left me behind." We haven't, but it is taking a very long time. Part of the reason it's taking a long time is that there's a lot of demand, which is a good thing. There's a lot of demand for people who are, who have green cards. They're applying.
And I wouldn't say it's allocation of resources. So it's about what you want to do and when you do it. In an election year, depending on whatever it is, things can move faster if you want them to move faster. And it's not about the number of applicants. It's about sort of moving them. And the concept that you've been in the country for 10 years and it takes you a whole year for them to process to see if you can be a citizen seems weird to me.
Yeah, and you go under, talk about vetting. We haven't talked about vetting tonight. We've avoided that. But the government knows way more about me than most people. It's really amazing how much, this background check and things they do. And with the green card, it's even more so. You do medical exams and everything. But we're willing to do it. And immigrants are absolutely willing to do it.
Hi. Comment and a question. Quick comment in hearing you guys talk and in working with immigrant populations myself for health. It's very fascinating in dealing with some of the things that you're talking about, some of the fears and anxiety around immigrants coming in, especially when the citizen right of voting may not be exercised. So I just thought that was something interesting. But my question in talking about immigration, I think it's also important to note that there also is a huge brain drain because, again, when you're a professional and have things to offer, it is easier for you to get a visa, and that's true. It is easier for you to find channels or to have sponsorship or any of those things, whereas in humanitarian assistance worldwide, you're looking at the same communities where people are coming from, and they're not able to go back and assist because then their generations are then continuing here. So not that, people can't come here and stay if they want, it's a free country, but I just would love to hear your comments on how the brain drain impacts immigration and how we can move forward taking that into consideration so that way we're not just taking all the greatness that some of these amazing countries have, but we're also keeping a symbiotic relationship.
Right. So on the brain drain part, I don't know how, I do have comments with regards to that. Everybody isn't allowed to come here people go to different places and education happens at different levels. And right now, because of the limitations of the H-1B visa, a lot of people are going to other countries. So there used to be this tiering that would happen among First Nations and Second Nations. So in places where the United States used to be glaring ahead, now China is surpassing us, other countries are surpassing us because those people that we educated are taking our education and taking it back abroad. And sort of the concept of, like I said before, when that immigrant sort of gets that education and they're able to get a job here, they sort of elevate their entire family. And you see that in the Indian population where they sort of raise the level of education, the family, the freedom of the women to come here and sort of that sort of thing that happens. But in addition to that, there's something else that you can sort of think about on the other end. If you think about Western Union and the growth of Western Union among the southern states and how Mexico has sort of stabilized is because a lot of people were coming here doing temporary work and they were sending the money back home to those economies, infusing and raising up the wealth there. So that's another way to sort of bring a community up, is to sort of have this concept of infusing, opportunity and wealth in those countries, because the money can go further in Mexico. So that's one of the reasons why now sort of the Mexican trade is at a net zero. So less Mexicans are coming here because there's such a growth in their population. So the brain drain argument is kind of what it is, but it is working in both ways. I mean, they're definitely the Fulbright program. There's definitely American Outreach. There's a year-end. We give tons of stuff in those different areas. You just have to think about it on balance.
And I just want to add to that. I think there's a lot of temptations when talking about immigration to think about either or. Either we do this or we do that. Right. When really a lot of these things are both and I think that the same thing happens here in the U.S. Like, should we invest in people who were born here, or should we should do both. We should do both.
And why can't we do both?
And why can't we?
It's a very rich country.
That's right. So that's one thought. But I also want to say this. I think one thing that a lot of people don't realize is that we're an aging society. The demographics are actually stacked against us right now, and we're already seeing this play out in a lot of parts of the country. So Dayton, which is a city we've worked with for a long time, was seeing 50 years of population decline. And what that means is that you've got a shrinking tax base, same level of infrastructure to support, same level of services to support, and your city goes bankrupt in that process, and that hurts everyone. They've been able to now turn that around because they've been able to attract and keep people in the city. Immigration is not all of that, but it's been a huge part of that, and their welcoming agenda has really driven that. And that means that there are more stores opening on Main Street, more people are buying homes. It benefits everyone. So this is the story that we also need to be reminding ourselves of is, we can think of this from a scarcity perspective, as we are constantly encouraged every day on the news to do, or we can think about it from an abundance perspective and think about how our communities and our economies can grow when we truly are an inclusive and equitable society.
It's a shy audience.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks for your presentation. It's very good to talk about immigration and the policy. How are we going to promote everybody's productivity? So on this, I think we have to really on positive side and a negative side, and have some kind of constructive approach. So we will not just say immigration. You are talking about just sort of year-round. Currently, we can see why immigration they are not welcome, because they are used to do some disservice to the society. This is a fact. Because they are used, and they thought they have a job, but their job is really negative, disservice. And what we are doing, we have to do is promote the good productivity and eliminate those negative. For instance, if a car dealers, they are not have a car general assembly to produce a car and to have a good family, have good living, but instead they go ask people to steal people's car, rob people's account. That this is not good. Just give a people impression that if you can do this, you got to be inferior. So this is very good. That kind of people, integrity is lost, and your productivity is lost. And also they can use this to discriminate people for their employment. Because they can use it. If you do this and you don't have to say anything, I can do this, I can discriminate. So a lot of improper processing of complaint and proceedings, including the bad legislation that take away your all resources. So your home, your car, your driver license, everything. So if you want to be productive, you must counter and fight against those negative things. And then our government, and I suppose white people can do a lot of things, but white people, they are also victimized. So that's why they don't like minorities, because they think minority is victimize them. They don't really distinguish the problem, the basic problem. We have to fight the root cause. And the root cause is really is justice and fairness. That's real basic. And the basic is the good concept of constructive, rather than just say, we can do something, but your human capital, your financial capital are all gone. How could you do anything? The same as media, you can be a good artist, but if your equipment, if your paintbrush are all taken away, you cannot do anything. So we must really fight against and promote our system to be a fairness and justice system. And if you send people to jail, you cannot ask them to do things.
Thank you for your comments. I think it's true. We want to make sure that we have a fair system and a just system. We want to motivate people to be productive. The more productive a society is, the wealthier we are, and the greater potential for us to actually share that wealth. And that goes back into our discussion about infrastructure and schools and how we're spending money and how we're lifting all of our lives up and our communities. I don't know if there are any more questions, but I'd certainly like to get some. Oh, we do have another one. Go ahead, please.
Janice.
Good evening. My name is Janice Farabee. I'm a docent at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And this is just a comment. First of all, thank you so very much for the panel and for Nolan doing this. But as a storyteller myself at the museum, this is a wonderful way to bring those conversations out for people that don't look like you, to talk about what it takes, because that's what I do in the museum. So I just want to thank you and acknowledge you for making this possible and for introducing this forum to people. Thank you.
And we want to thank you for the most compelling, moving, beautiful museum on the mall.
Beautiful. I also see someone here, and I want to recognize her because of her contribution. Denise Rolock Barnes, will you please stand? Editor-in-Chief of the Washington Informer. Thank you so much for coming, Denise. If you do not support the Washington Informer, please do so. It's great work.
I was reading a report a couple of days ago, and the article was arguing that in Trump's America, it's not necessarily people being upset about the loss of economic opportunities related to immigration. It's actually the loss of status and the decline of white identity, which sort of goes back to an old Du Boisian idea about the wages of whiteness. This idea that white skin, white identity has value. And the idea that as America becomes more multiracial, that this segment of the population is losing something. In terms of thinking about policy, in terms of thinking about a response, how do we be sensitive to that as we think about immigration reform?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. I read the same article, and it is really fascinating. I think the panel is going to want to weigh in on this, but I'll give you one thought, which is I think what my organization is doing by listening to people is key. I would really encourage everybody to take a deep breath when you go on Twitter. So many times I want to answer. Most of the time I just try to see what people are saying. I think that's a starting point. The only way that we are going to change this conversation, the only way we're going to do it is to listen to the other person. Yeah, maybe, when I hear this, that people are afraid of losing their status and all that, and that diversity is somehow a threat, I'm thinking, diversity, that's the greatest richness we have. But that's me. So what is, I want to hear what this other person's anxiety is. It takes a lot to listen to some of this stuff sometimes, but that's a place to start.
For me, in the West Side Story sort of comment, I think this is one of the interesting things when I sort of watched it, and it's the Puerto Ricans and this white American gang. For me, I just thought, oh, you're both white, right? I mean, you're really both white. And I think the concept that you sort of understand America is that for a long time, if you were Asian or Indian national or Hispanic, you could type white, right? And so the creation of the boxes made the divide of the numbers, which brought awareness to the concern of the growth, right? As well as the pigmentation, right? And I think that fear that you have, you'll never ever walk away from that fear. If that's the heart of if that's the premise of your conversation, is this pureness that sort of happens in royalty and those unique societies that just don't exist anymore, you just can't. It just won't happen anymore. And if that's the root of your concern, then just like other things, racism, desegregation, they just have to die out. It's just, you're fighting science at that point. And to have the conversation to understand that that's what the problem is to understand, okay, well then with this person there might not be a win, but then you might have a conversation with someone else that might be about opportunity education or something else in their community to understand. And what that goes back to is something that Esther knows more than anything else. There is a budget. You can buy a bomb, you can buy a school, you can help people immigrate. It's all about where you put your money and your finances to sort of balance things out. And the political balance that sort of happens with having the argument between the others. Scapegoating a group sometimes gives political capital to those who gain control. And it is my perspective that 45 has the White House sort of beating the drum of the concern of people that probably didn't have a reason to have the concern, but now all of a sudden you have fires coming, a criminal's coming, someone's coming to get something. That fear that sort of comes in you with no reality, not based on anything that just exists, right? It's this weird boogeyman that I can't.
Yeah, but I don't know that he initiated that. I think he tapped into something. Yeah. I really think he tapped into something. And the question becomes, what do we do about that? I find it very interesting, though, that the posture in general is to just let all this happen, right? We see now reports that white supremacy groups are on the uprise. And we've had public kinds of events where people have been identified. And yet those persons, to my knowledge, are not being interrogated in any kind of way. But when other groups in our country decide to come together and take a stand, then there's a different kind of response, right? So I think these are very, very interesting times. And I think it's the reason why we have to have these kinds of conversations. But then we also have to leave these kinds of experiences and see ourselves as advocates. Like, we have to be engaged in the political process. We have to be in touch with our congressional representatives, whoever they are. We have to be a part of the solution. Otherwise, we're, even by just neglect, a part of the problem.
And I'll just add, very few people like change of any kind, and especially change that makes you feel uncomfortable. And I think one thing that we're not in the sort of sphere of public debate not doing a very good job of is separating people who are anxious about change and about losing status from people who are like true haters. And I think that it's incumbent on leaders today to paint a picture of what this country looks like when we win, right? And who gets to belong in that. And maybe we need to move people through some uncomfortable conversations to recognize, yeah, this change is hard and it may look a little bit different on the other end, but we're all in this together, and that's the kind of America we want to be. There's a great piece, and I feel terrible that I'm forgetting the person's name who coined this, but he talks about bridging woke America with great America, which is the most succinct way I've heard it put. And he talks about, if woke America wins, and woke America is going to win, that's a good thing. How is woke America preparing now to be the leaders of tomorrow? Because woke America is very focused now on fighting the fight. But what does it actually look like to lead and win? And what kind of America does that look like on the other side? And I love that because it's not a question I think we're asking ourselves enough of. What does that America look like on the
It's
other
not
side?
just about defeating bad ideas, it's about presenting good ideas.
Right, not just resisting
Being able
creating.
to legislate.
Yeah, I think a point you made, and I think it's one that you were alluding to, the gentleman with the question is, yeah, there are a lot of people that are afraid of what's happening and the changes that are occurring, but many of them are not, the whites, the vast majority are not haters, white supremacists, just
Not everybody's Archie Bunker.
xenophobes. Yeah, they're just people that are genuinely afraid of what's going on and feeling like they're going to be marginalized. And I think it's going to be so important that as we are advocating for different policies and different changes, that we incorporate, their concerns, talk to them, listen to them, and make sure that we're advocating for all people who feel marginalized one way or another.
Did we have one more question? No? Oh, sorry. Lady over here.
I debated whether I was going to actually say this because I was like, okay, this is pretty negative. On the one hand, DACA, the lack of support in this current administration, I know people who are affected and it hurts. But on the other hand, I'm like, okay, so what comes next? Where is the pause or the stop button? What happens to the steady, continual influx into our country where, even though we're not very happy with it, at least I'm not right now, a lot of people want to be?
So it's one of the things that I often am challenged with. Sometimes I talk with Fox News. And I don't think that the concept is this dichotomy that it's either open borders or closed borders, right? It's control of the system and the way that people sort of come in. And then I think there's an equity argument because if you're talking about equities, the DACA people have strong equities. They are the most legitimate out of the 11 million that you need to come to face with and just come to terms with. Now, the concept of, our America and invasion, I think, is problematic because I think the concept is that we're part of a global society and we're part of making ourselves better. So the flow should be like the economy. We want to accept people who can make us better, whatever that is and whatever the flow and the tolerate rate is, and that everybody was the last people to come. And it can't be, oh my God, you just took the last cheese. This concept of a zero-sum game and there's being a pizza, there's only so many slices of it, is part of the basis of the argument where people say, well, they're overcrowding our schools, they're overcrowding this. And that's not what's overcrowding your schools. Bad schools and communities aren't the function, but I think on the greater end, your concern may be better addressed by this Welcoming Americas because as we age, right, Social Security is going to run out, our population is going to run out, and our military is going to run out. So as that sort of bell curve becomes reality in the economic sense, we need people coming here. We're at a deficit right now composed to the rest of the world. So if you take our net immigration as compared to what Canada's doing, for example, you will find that they're on a greater trajectory for a long-term sort of growth. So the concept of thinking, keep them out will make more for us, and the end will make less.
Yeah, thank you for that question, by the way. This is a very important point, and it's good that somebody expresses that honestly. Absolutely. Yeah. Do we have one more? You one more? We'll take one more. Oh.
Well, I was going to ask the question, and I can see what I love the sports stars. What is meant by land of the free and home of the brave? What is meant by that? Just for one group of people? And everybody else, you're out. Now, immigration, the Africans and the Mexicans are not allowed to come in, but the Asians can come in. So is this a land of the free and home of the brave? No. Unless we become like little children. I work around little children. And they have so much love, they don't care who you are. They're hugging and kissing one another. But then the parents instill in the child, you are better. Who's better? There's not any race any better. We all gonna die the same way. So how are you any better? So stop and think about what America is and become like little children and love one another. Because that's the only way America will be great. When we begin to love and let one another know we're all the same. Your color doesn't mean any better than my color. Your hair doesn't look any better than my hair. So why do I want to look like you? I love the way I look. And my parents... And my parents instilled that in us. That's my son up there, Reverend Nolan Williams. Yes. When I walk on the street, I don't think nobody looks as good as I look. So I don't worry about you. And your color, you don't have anything on me that I have. So we need to have love like little children and stop saying, oh, I'm better, I'm white. Well, what is white gonna do? You're gonna die one day and go down to hell. So you better get yourself in straight with God and realize that love is the things that are gonna make the world better. Not color, not races or people. God bless you.
I wish my mom were here. Yeah.
Well, I wanted to say, I think a big part of this problem is really lack of education and lack of exposure. For instance, my brother-in-law, maybe 8 years ago, was on the ticket, reluctantly so, for Lieutenant Governor of Colorado. He did become Lieutenant Governor. His last name was Garcia. People came out of the woodwork saying, go back to Mexico. His family has never lived in Mexico. And I think that this knee-jerk reaction that people have to hearing a name that they consider to be other or something automatically sets off something in their minds that this person must be foreign and they must be trying to take things. So their argument was, here it is, this foreigner is trying to take a public office in America. And he's like, you know, my family's probably been here longer than your family has. So I think that, you know, this kind of isolationism that people put themselves in, calling it their community, has done us somewhat of a disservice when we cannot get outside of that to understand what goes on in other communities. So I think that, you know, the idea of staying in your neighborhood or whatever really needs to change so that people understand and are exposed to the fact that people with different names are not always immigrants. Immigrants might have the same name that they consider to be American. You know, people come from England, their last name might be Smith. They would not be regarded as an immigrant, even though they are. So I think that, you know, really it's education and exposure that will overcome a lot of the problems that we have in understanding other people's plights and other people's presence. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment.
That's a great point.
Thank you.
Let me just say, and that's the reason why we're doing this. You know, that's the reason why we're doing it. We have to use every tool available to help expose people to what they're not getting in textbooks or what may not be taught in classrooms or even in homes. We've got to count, and certainly what we see kind of propagated through the media and what's going on in our political arenas. We have to find ways to counter that, right? And we believe that the arts is a key way to do that. So, thank you.
So I'm going to ask our panelists just to give a brief closing remarks and thank them. All right. Okay.
Well, I think the comment that I just sort of thought of here, Nolan's mom, and the comment in the back is that if you sort of think about religion and your house of worship in most religions that aren't by birth, you're always welcoming. You never think to yourself, there's not enough room on the pew, or we don't have enough space for someone else to come in to your faith when you sort of think about that, right? No one ever has a church that says we're closed or the door's too packed or we're not interested anymore, right? You build a bigger cathedral, you build a bigger crowd, you make more food. So I think if we sort of think about America as that sort of concept of having something of greatness and power, and we remember that we are innovators, we got to the moon first, then we can find a solution for this problem.
I think I'll just pick up on what you said. This is an incredible country. I wasn't born here. I came as an immigrant too, as a refugee and naturalized. And the opportunities that we have here for so many people, for those who have been here for generations and generations, and for newcomers, and for people who want to come in. There is room for all of us. We have incredible wealth. We have incredible values. We have an incredible democratic system that can welcome many, many people. I think it's a myth that the entire world wants to come here. I think most people want to live in the countries that they're in, and only leave because circumstances drive them out. But when they come here, they make us better as a country, and we need to keep that in mind and not try to close our systems. Yes, we need orderly, legal methods to come in where people are properly vetted and so forth, but that can exist.
There's a song in West Side Story called America, and the part of the lines go, I like to be in America, yeah, okay by me in America, everything free in America for a small fee in America. Which is a joke about many things, but I think about what that fee really is in America. Like what's the fee that we pay in a positive way? And I think the fee that we pay in a positive way in America is our civic obligation. And I love this idea of citizen artists. But now is a time to get active, to get involved. I hope this conversation is a call to action to you, because you are the shapers of the communities that you live in. And so whether it's just an interaction with your neighbor, or advocating in City Hall for policies that make it possible for more people to be part of this community and feel at home here, or whether it's voting in an election, I mean, we have the power in this room to change the reality we live in. That's the aspirational fee that we pay in America, and it's time to pay up.
Do you want to wrap it up? Yeah, okay. So my thoughts, I think it's very true that there's a myth that everybody in the world wants to come here. It's a great country. Not everybody wants to come here. People come here seeking opportunity, educational opportunities, job opportunities, the opportunity perhaps to be with a person they love. Very few people come here just because, hey, it would be fun to go and live somewhere else. It takes a lot of moxie. Okay. Let me tell you, Siri. So I think that immigrants do play a big role in revitalizing communities and in changing the conversation. But I think they can also, we, as we're talking about art, bridging and healing this evening, I think immigrants can play part of that role too, if we let them. If we let ourselves meet other people and talk to other people and listen to other people. I'm going to let Nolan finish. I'm going to thank his mother for her participation and for being here tonight. And I'm going to thank all of you as well for your willingness to come and to listen and talk to others and listen to others.
So thank you, Cathleen, and thank you so much. These are my new friends. I just met them, and so grateful for all that you have brought to this discussion this evening, and excited to start a journey with you, because I think we're connected now, and there's work that we should be doing moving forward. So Rachel and Kathleen, thank you very much. My long-established friends, Alan and Esther, who I called and said, don't you want to be on this panel? And twisted arms. Thank you both for coming to be a part of this. And I know your worlds are crazy, so thank you for making time. Can we just thank all of the panels? So I need to again thank New York University for NYU for being a partner on this NYU Dialogues, and Kevin, thank you, and Polly, thank you, and Michael, thank you. I know Tom is otherwise engaged, but they have been amazing partners in helping us to put all this together. And so can we just give it up for NYU Dialogues? So let me just say this. This exhibition is here through the end of the month, so please help us spread the word. The doors are open here Monday through Friday, right? Kevin, remind me.
Friday, 9 to 6 p.m.
So you can just come or invite people to come and check out the exhibition. So will you do that? I mean, that's part of how you can pay it forward, right? By encouraging folk in your communities to come and check this out. And then you all can have conversation about what's in the exhibition, and you can help to carry this conversation forward. We need to thank some amazing partners, and so on behalf of NEWorks, I want to thank, they're not here, but the Mann Center for the Performing Arts. We have worked with the Mann Center. This is our 6th year of working with them and developing curatorial festival partners. They are amazing, and I'm so grateful to have that partnership with them and the work that we continue to do to bring this kind of programming to the community. So I want to thank the Mann Center and Kathy Cahill in her absence, and Rhoda Blunt, who is our VP of Education, education consultant now because she just retired. And then I want to thank our friends at Fulton County Arts and Culture, Lionel Thomas, who's the director there, and Kristen Maddox and all the folk there in Atlanta who are working to make this happen. So this exhibition will be here through the 30th, and then it will leave here and travel to Atlanta. It will be at the Woodruff Art Center in the Car Gallery, the Beauchamp Car Gallery. We're extremely excited about that. The Woodruff Art Center is the main art center where Symphony Hall is and the Hyde Museum and all that in Atlanta. And we're thrilled that we have gallery space there for this exhibition. There will be an opening event taking place there on June the 9th. So if you've got friends in Atlanta, tell them to come on out on June 9th for our opening event. Exhibition will be up through June 9th through June 30th, and then it will leave there and travel to Philadelphia, where we'll go up in the Free Library of Philadelphia's Parkway branch, the main branch on the Parkway, the 2nd floor West Gallery. And that opening will be on July the 11th, and it will be in Philadelphia on display from July 11th through August 30th. So have a long run there in Philadelphia. So tell your friends in Philadelphia to come check this out as well. You get the idea, right? Hopefully all of you also, when you register today, you register to be made aware of other events like this. We need your support moving forward, and so this is not only on our behalf, but on behalf of NYU Dialogues. We're all trying to build relationship with the community and to make you aware of this kind of programming. So if you didn't check the box before, maybe you're a little more inspired to go back and check it now. Encourage you to go to NYU's website, go to the Mann Center's website, go to Fulton County's website, and definitely go to NEWorks Productions website, NEWorks Productions.com. Please go and check out the work that we are doing. I think that's it. Want to thank our NEWorks team and all those who have worked behind the scenes, Avita, Karen, and Terry, thank you so much. And all of my friends who are here, thank you all so much for being present. I reached out to many of you directly, so thank you. Do this now. We're going to move upstairs, and if you haven't had a chance to see the exhibition, we invite you to do that. But also take the time to meet someone you don't know, and take the time to meet someone who doesn't look like you tonight. I think that's part of the spirit of what we're trying to do as well, right? Take the time to do that before you go. Thank you so much. God bless you. Thank you for coming.